Made with Spoken. Theodore Langley, Gears of Thought and Steam, by Gabriel Stroup. Digital narration performed by Emo Edward. 1. A Steward's Hubris. Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary, 1914, A Fool's Errand.
Sophie, don't die. Live for our children. Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Theodore Langley stepped off the locomotive, the sharp whistle cutting through the crisp morning air. The clatter of market stalls and the pungent scent of horse dung filled the streets. He adjusted his tweed coat, pulling the weight of his timepiece from his pocket. Its intricate network of gears confirmed he had arrived at the exact moment history would begin to fracture. If he could prevent the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he could unmake the war that had shattered empires, slaughtered millions, and had taken his father before Theodore was old enough to understand what had happened. His father's last words, "History needs stewards, son," haunted him as he matured. But even now, could he really be sure what his father meant? The Great War had not been inevitable. No war was. History was merely a series of fragile moments, so all it took was a single well-placed hand to tip the scales and save his father from ever having to leave Theodore's side. Theodore studied this day from every possible angle. He knew the layout of Sarajevo's streets by heart, memorized the timing of each stop along the motorcade route, and mapped out every conspirator's position, weapon, and intent. He had traced the Archduke's movements from the moment he arrived in the city to the fatal wrong turn that sealed his fate. He analyzed witness testimonies, cross-referenced accounts, and accounted for every possible variable. If history had any chance of proceeding as it always has, he needed to be flawless. The brass surface of his timepiece hissed faintly as warm steam escaped through tiny vents. Tracing his finger over the cool metal, Theodore felt the warmth seep into his palm, grounding him. It had been his father's once. The one object his father placed in his hands before he left forever, emitting comfort that echoed through his life. His father's voice was always sharp and clear in his memories, but here, Theodore forced it aside. He cannot afford to be distracted. Theodore ambled through the city, passing women in elegant hats and men flicking cigarette ash into the street. Conversations in Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian all mixed together into a multicultural rhythm of a living city. Ahead was Franz Joseph Street and Appel Quay, and there, loitering in the shadows outside Moritz Schiller's delicatessen, was Gavrilo Princip. Theodore's pulse quickened as he saw Princip. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him with each stride. Every step felt like it might be the one that would either make or break everything he'd worked for. As he approached, the city's noise seemed to fade, replaced by the thudding in his ears. A bead of sweat traced down his temple. His breathing matched the tempo of the steam from the timepiece in his coat pocket. Its soft hiss was a constant reminder of history's pressure. The motorcade would turn the corner at any moment. Princip moved. The young assassin's face was gaunt, his eyes hidden under the shadow of his cap. His coat was drawn tight, with a faint outline visible where the gun rested. The crowd around them thinned as the motorcade approached, and Princip's hand slipped into his coat. Without thinking, Theodore surged forward, his hand darting toward Princip's wrist, closing around it in a vice-like grip. For a second, he thought he might succeed. He could feel the pistol's cold metal beneath his fingers just within reach. The sound of an old, sputtering engine reached their ears. Princip's hand jerked free, and with a surge of strength, he pulled the gun from his coat. Theodore's heart skipped a beat as he saw the gun's barrel swing towards the open car. The Archduke was seconds away from being in the line of fire. Theodore's blood raced, every muscle in his body screaming for action. History was right in front of him, waiting for his intervention. Princip was strong, far stronger than Theodore had anticipated. The assassin's fist slammed into Theodore's stomach, knocking the air from his lungs. Theodore staggered back, gasping for breath, but his grip remained locked on Princip's wrist. He could feel the cold steel of the gun pressing against his chest, inches from his skin, perfectly willing to die to save his father from a senseless war. Princip's hand trembled with panic, but he was relentless, forcing the gun upward, aiming for the Archduke. Theodore's vision blurred with adrenaline as he struggled to maintain control. Every second felt like a lifetime. His fingers were slick with sweat, his arms screaming with strain. He had prepared for this. He had all the power in the world to stop this. The gun was moving closer as the engine sounds got louder. He could almost feel the heat of the shot before it was fired. Princip's free hand swung at Theodore's face, landing a sharp blow across his cheek. Theodore's head snapped back, ignoring the blinding pain. His stomach lurched as he fought to remain standing, fighting against the dizzying vertigo. He could not give up on his father, not now. Theodore twisted harder, trying to wrench the gun away, but Princip's grip was ironclad, his knuckles turned white with the effort. The engine stalled, and the first shot rang out. The explosion of sound was deafening, but not nearly as deafening as the blast of pain that tore through Theodore's side. His breath caught in his throat as his vision dimmed, feeling the bullet lodged itself deep in his flesh. He gasped, his knees buckling, but his hand still gripped Princip's wrist. Theodore could still change it. The second shot followed almost instantly. Theodore's world narrowed down to a sharp, biting pain as the second bullet found its mark. This time the world spun, and he collapsed to the ground, the weight of history crashing onto him. He saw Princip standing over him, staring at his target. Theodore shakily looked behind him as he laid weak on the street, scarcely making out the shapes. The Archduke slumped forward in his seat, the blood blossoming across his white uniform as he clutched his beloved, pleading for her survival. The cries of the crowd swelled around Theodore, but they were drowned out by the pulsing roar in his ears. Princip gave Theodore one last, unreadable look before quickly running away with the crowd. Theodore gasped for air, his vision flickering. The pain was excruciating, spreading across his entire body like his nerves caught on fire. Yet this pain was nothing compared to the pain of realization. Despite Theodore's best effort, history had proceeded as it always has. He found the strength to feel for his timepiece and twisted the tiny gears. It felt immensely warm and heavy in his hand as the streets, noises, and pain all faded away. The clamor of Sarajevo blurred into stone columns and open-air forums. Theodore blinked against the sudden change, the sound of heated debate filling his ears and mind. His body numbed from the bullet's sting as it faded into a deeper ache. Beneath the pain, guilt twisted inside him, lingering as the physical pain subsided. He had studied every detail, but the crucial moment had slipped through his fingers. How could one man stand against the weight of time itself? The soft hiss of steam whispered through the brass, and for a moment Theodore thought he could hear his father's voice again. "History needs stewards, son," his father said, kneeling beside him on a crowded train platform, the hiss of locomotives and noise of families all around them. Theodore had been young and confused, unable to grasp the full weight of those words. But now, standing on the precipice of his mission, he felt their truth in every fiber of his being. His father had taught that history was a series of moments, and those moments needed to be tended to carefully. Theodore believed he could change just one of those moments. But now, having been soaked in blood on the streets of Sarajevo, with the weight of his father's lessons pressing against him, the truth felt different. He believed that history was fragile, that a single action could redirect its course, but history fought back. In the face of all his preparation and all his calculations, nothing had changed. He had not stopped the war. He had not saved his father. The bitterness of failure festered inside, but the gears turned in Theodore's mind as the gears slowed in his timepiece. His heart still thudded in his chest, but a new, unfamiliar resolve was beginning to settle in his bones. History had fought back in ways he didn't expect, but now Theodore saw a new truth. He couldn't simply wait for the right moment or the perfect twist of fate. History had its own momentum, carrying its own unyielding force. This force was something to confront head-on. Theodore wasn't going to be a passive spectator anymore. He wasn't going to try to steer history with the delicate touch of a bystander. If he was going to alter its course, he had to challenge it, face it, and somehow make it bend to his will. It wasn't just about saving his father anymore. His father had become a captive of history, trapped in its unrelenting grip, a hostage to the events that had defined his fate. Theodore would become the negotiator, the one who would demand a different outcome. He would confront the very essence of history itself, not with submission, but with the intent to strike a deal that would free his father from the chains history had placed around him. As he stood among marbled columns, he clutched the timepiece, feeling the weight of his father's words echoing in his mind. It wasn't enough to simply witness history unfold. He would have to fight for it. He would have to confront the past and demand something different. He was done being a passive observer. The past had its grip on him, but he was going to fight back. He would bend history to his will by confronting it himself. Rome, Italy, 44 BCE. The Ides and the Unyielding Tide.
I would rather be the first man in a village than the second man in Rome, Julius Caesar.
Theodore Langley stumbled out of the vortex, the hiss of his timepiece swallowed by the noise of ancient Rome, a city of marble and ambition. He inhaled deeply, breathing in the air rank with salt and olive oil. His mission was clear: to stop Caesar's assassination. Failure haunted him still, as a victim of the gunfire in Sarajevo that didn't save his father. The Great War had unfolded as if he had never been there, destined to ripple into the fate of his father and into an even greater war that reshaped the world. He held deep in his chest the memory of standing between the Archduke and his killer, when he bore a pain that paled in comparison to the realization that all of his research and foresight just wasn't enough. Perhaps the complexity of early 1900s politics had been too far ahead of history's tipping point. Here, in a world ruled by orators, Theodore had more control. He could persuade and negotiate, become a player, not a mere bystander. If he succeeded, he could rewrite the ending of history, preventing the tragedy he'd failed to stop in Sarajevo, and saving his father in the process. Theodore navigated the bustling streets, his sandals slapping against the cobblestones. He had studied every detail of this day: the conspirators, their motives, and the layout of the Senate. He knew that Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus led the plot, believing Caesar's rise threatened the Republic, but Theodore knew better. As he approached the theater of Pompey where the Senate convened, he spotted a group of senators huddled in whispered conversation. Among them was Brutus, his face betraying uncertainty even as Cassius spoke with steely resolve. Theodore's heart pounded as he stepped forward, calling out in the tongue of statesmen and orators as his father taught him. "Senator," Theodore called out, striding toward Brutus. "A word, please?" Brutus turned, his brow furrowing.
"Do I know you? Do you belong here?"
"We have a mutual acquaintance," Theodore improvised, stepping closer. "A soothsayer who warned of great peril today." Brutus's eyes narrowed.
"You speak of Spurinna?"
"Yes," Theodore said, recalling the seer's name from his studies. He foresaw a dire outcome if Caesar attends the Senate. Theodore's words spilled forth, his Latin flowing as naturally as his breath. This was his father's language, a major language of history, law's fate, and men who believed their words alone could shape the world. It was also the language of a republic already crumbling, of orators whose speeches could not stop the march of empire. Theodore pressed on, his voice desperate. "You believe you act in defense of Rome, but you do not see what follows. You strike down one man, but in doing so you destroy the republic you claim to protect. Civil war will follow, bloodshed beyond measure, the Senate will not be restored, it will be abolished. Brutus paled, his breath hitching.
That cannot be.
Theodore's voice wavered, desperation further seeping in. It is. The republic will die today, Brutus, not with Caesar's rise, but with his fall. Brutus glanced at his fellow conspirators, then back at Theodore.
And what would you have me do?
Delay the meeting, Theodore urged. Convince the Caesar to stay away. If harm befalls him, it will plunge Rome into chaos. Brutus hesitated, his gaze darting to Cassius, to the Senate doors, and back to Theodore. Theodore had spoken in the language of Rome, pleaded in the tongue of its politicians, negotiated with history with the words that had shaped empires, toppled kings, built and broken entire civilizations. For a moment, Brutus took Theodore's words to heart, for anyone speaking his own tongue so flawlessly deserved to be recognized. But he had little time to consider his options. Right then, a hush fell over the gathered senators. Caesar had arrived. The conspirators stiffened, hands drifting toward concealed daggers. For a moment, time slowed, and Theodore stood paralyzed, his mind racing. This was it. The moment that had defied him, a moment as unshakable as the fall of the Archduke. He had played his cards with history and warned its makers in their own language, but it wasn't enough. A hand grasped Caesar's shoulder, then another. The first blade struck. No! Theodore surged forward, shoving past stunned senators, reaching desperately for Caesar's arm. Caesar! His Latin dissolved into raw, unrestrained English. Beware! History didn't listen. A second dagger buried itself in Caesar's side, followed by another. Chaos erupted as the conspirators closed in, their blades flashing in the dim torchlight. Caesar gasped, stumbling, his once pristine toga now marred with streaks of crimson. Theodore grabbed at the nearest assassin, wrenching his arm back, but before he could react, something else struck him. A sharp force drove into his side, suddenly and decisively. His breath hitched, pain flared white-hot in his ribs. Theodore staggered as he lost his footing, twisting to see an unfamiliar senator, face grim, already retreating into the chaos. Theodore could only watch as Caesar's end played out before him. Caesar coughed. Blood bubbled at his lips as he turned to Brutus. His body received the dagger while his voice escaped strained and disbelieving.
And you, Brutus?
Caesar collapsed at the foot of Pompey's statue, his body crumpling in a pool of his own blood. The Senate chamber, once filled with hushed anticipation moments before, now rang with the echoes of fleeing footsteps as the assassins scattered like rats from a sinking ship. Theodore clutched at his own wound, his fingers coming away slick with blood. He tried to move, trying to speak, but his body couldn't respond. Through the haze of moving bodies, he caught Brutus's gaze one last time. There was regret in it, but not enough. Brutus stood for only a second before falling in step with the retreating crowd. Theodore had thrown himself yet again into history's path, but history had cut him and Caesar down without hesitation. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he lay on his side beside the fallen ruler, just as what happened in Sarajevo. Failure gripped him colder than the stone beneath him, almost as cold as he felt when he learned his father would never return. His father's handwriting, scrawled on an old note from the chest of artifacts he had inherited, reading, "To my son, whom I trust will continue the tradition of stewardship for the sanctity of history." Theodore clutched the memory like a talisman. He had always thought it was his legacy to shape history, but now it felt like a curse, an inheritance that had doomed him not once, but now twice. Had his fascination with history ever been his own? Or had it been cultivated, set in motion by the father he had lost, by the ancestors he had never known? Had his father seen this fate coming? If history could be shaped, then why couldn't his father's fate be reshaped? Could Theodore even control his own fate? The questions rattled in his mind as the pain chilled through his body. But no answer would change the reality pressing down on him now. The blood pooled. The walls towered, and history moved forward. indifferent, decisive, and unstoppable. Lying in the blood of his own and the former emperor, Theodore exhaled sharply, his hands trembling. He had convinced himself that history could be reasoned with, that knowledge and foresight granted him leverage over time itself. But here, in the halls where the Republic bled out, he saw the truth. History was not a debate to be won, nor a course to be gently redirected. It was a truly unyielding force, written not in words but in marble, steel, blood, and silence. He had bargained and reasoned with history, and in return, it struck him down with a dagger. With shaking fingers, he reached for his timepiece, blood-stained and scuffed, twisting back the tiny gears. The familiar comforting steam hissed through the brass tubes as the world blurred and the scene of Caesar's death dissolved into nothingness. The intense pain on his side dulled away as the sounds of car radios and color television repleted his senses. The sun was high, reflecting off steel and glass rather than marble and stone. The crowd had gathered, murmuring, excited. In a matter of minutes, history would lurch forward again, unyielding as ever. History continued to be an unyielding force, impervious to both impulsive action and careful negotiation. Even so, it still wasn't some sentient being. It still had a weakness, blindness. History saw what has already been written, but it never sees the hands that guided the pen. Theodore had tried to reason with it, to bend it to his will with words and actions, but now he saw the futility in that. If history could not be fought head-on or negotiated with, perhaps it could just be slipped past, unnoticed, like a shadow in a room too bright for anyone to see. Theodore was done fighting inevitability. Sarajevo had taught him the futility of simple action. Rome had taught him the futility of words. Here he would not warn. He would not argue. He would simply move in silence, unseen, altering details so subtly that history might not notice the shift. His mission wasn't lost. His father's life and the legacy he had entrusted to Theodore could still be salvaged, but the approach would have to change. No longer would Theodore stand at the crossroads of history to be a mere bystander or a negotiator. A new plan was forming in his mind, one that required patience, subtlety, and a dexterous touch. This time he would shape the course of events without ever truly touching them. His father had told him that history was not kind, but perhaps, if one moved quietly enough, it did not have to be cruel. Dallas, USA, 1963, a shot heard across time.
A man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on. Ideas have endurance without death. John F. Kennedy.
Theodore Langley materialized in a dimly lit alleyway. He straightened his navy blue suit, adjusting his black tie and taking a deep breath. The air was thick with anticipation. The president was in town. His mission was as clear as it always was: prevent the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. He had tried to stop assassins twice before. In Sarajevo, he had been a passing good Samaritan, while in Rome, he attempted to negotiate with the assassins himself. Both times, history found a way to correct itself. Dallas would be different. It had to be. His father had been swallowed by the Great War. Another soldier lost to what was considered inevitability, but Theodore knew inevitability was a lie. It had to be. If history could not be guided, then what was the purpose of being a steward? He had studied wars at the anatomical level, traced their roots, and dissected every cause and consequence. Sarajevo proved a single bullet could ignite a war. Rome showed him empires unraveled through moments, not fate. Now in Dallas, history stood poised to repeat itself once again, another shot waiting to shape the world. Theodore couldn't prevent his father's fate, but maybe he could prevent the fate of those still to come. He couldn't save his father from a war of horses and repeating rifles, but perhaps he could stop millions from dying in wars of helicopters, espionage, and nuclear brinkmanship. Maybe this time it would all mean something. Maybe this time it will finally be enough to break history's flow. As always, Theodore had studied every second of this day. He had memorized every map, every documented testimony, every photograph of Dealey Plaza. He had run countless scenarios in his mind, considering every possible intervention. He had analyzed security weaknesses, studied Oswald's psyche, even pored over ballistics reports. Sarajevo taught him that preparation alone was not enough. Persuasion had failed him in Rome. He had tried to reason with history, to challenge it openly, and each time history had refused to yield to his demands. This time, Theodore would not confront history head-on. He would not intervene in plain sight. Instead, he would move in the shadows, acting before the moment could crystallize into inevitability. Warning the president was impossible. No one would believe him. A mysterious man predicting an assassination in Cold War America would only be arrested, or worse. He couldn't change the story after it was already being written. He had to erase the ink before it touched the page. That left only one option: stopping Oswald before he ever took the shot. Theodore navigated the bustling streets, his running shoes silently and swiftly gliding over the pavement. The crowds were already gathering, eager to catch a glimpse of the charismatic president and his elegant first lady. Excitement buzzed through the air, but Theodore's mind was focused on one figure: Lee Harvey Oswald, a disillusioned ex-Marine who carried history in a brown paper package as he strode towards his nest. Theodore moved with practiced ease, slipping into the Texas school book depository with quiet determination. The scent of ink and paper filled the dimly lit halls, a stark contrast to the charged anticipation buzzing in the streets outside. He had walked this path 1,000 times in his mind, studied every report, every photograph, every possible outcome. This time, he would not disrupt history with grand gestures or direct confrontation. He would simply act before the moment could solidify. He swiftly ascended the stairs, his heartbeat steady, his purpose singular. On the 6th floor, just as he had anticipated, Oswald knelt behind a barricade of boxes, his rifle laid out before him, methodically assembled piece by piece. The window framed the approaching motorcade, the crowd's cheers swelling as history barreled toward its appointed moment. Theodore left no moment to chance. He moved in silence, each step calculated, closing the distance between himself and the weapon. Oswald's attention was on the street below, his fingers adjusting the scope. A few more inches, and Theodore would have the rifle in his own hands. The floor creaked. Oswald snapped around, his expression shifting from focus to alarm.
Who the hell?
Theodore lunged, fingers closing around the rifle's barrel just as Oswald twisted to yank it away. They struggled, bodies colliding against the stacks of books and crates. The cheers outside grew deafening. Theodore gritted his teeth, wrenching at the rifle, but the Marine's grip was ironclad, as was Princip's grip decades before this moment. Theodore felt Oswald shift his weight, trying to angle the weapon in spite of Theodore's presence. Theodore renewed his resolve. He wouldn't let history play out again. He drove his shoulder forward, slamming Oswald against the wall. The gun jerked sideways, too fast, too sudden. The room erupted with sound. The rifle cracked, the force of the shot sending a violent ringing through Theodore's skull as he was forced away from the rifle. A second later, he lunged again at Oswald, his fingers clawing for the weapon, his pulse hammering in his ears. Another shot rang out. Time slowed. A terrible silence followed just for a moment before the chaos below swallowed it whole. The crowd fractured into screams, a cacophony of panic and horror rising from the streets. Theodore's breath was ragged as he continued to wrestle with Oswald, but his eyes were fixed on the window. The motorcade had slowed. Jackie Kennedy was hunched over her husband, her pink suit darkening with blood. A cold weight settled in Theodore's chest. History had slipped through his fingers once again. The Cold War would continue unchanged. Sarajevo, Rome, and now Dallas. 3 different strategies in 3 different eras, all leading to the same inevitable result. History needs stewards, son. His father's words once again echoed in his mind. But for the first time, they did not steady him. What did it mean to be a steward if history refused to be guided? If knowledge, preparation, and selective restraint were all powerless against the weight of inevitability, then what was the point? He had studied, acted, and risked everything to break the cycle. And still, history endured, indifferent and immovable. A bitter thought took root within Theodore, billowing through his mind like smoke. His father had always spoken with such authority, insisting that history was not to be controlled, just understood and respected. What if respect was just another form of submission? What if stewardship was merely an excuse to watch tragedy unfold, time and time again, without daring to change it? Back in reality, Oswald shoved Theodore back, tearing free from his grasp. Theodore barely registered the man's retreat, the pounding of footsteps as he disappeared into the stairwell. He stood frozen, his mind racing through every failed attempt. Every moment he had fought against history's current only to be dragged under. A bullet doesn't change history, it only reinforces it. Another phrase of his father's, said long before JFK had even been born. Theodore had never questioned the wisdom of those words before, but now, with the scent of gunpowder still thick in the air and the sound of sirens screaming from the streets below, they felt less like insight and more like an admission of helplessness. Theodore's fingers found his timepiece, hands trembling slightly as he activated it. Warm steam whistled through its brass tubes as Dallas dissolved into a blur of light and sound. Theodore left while one question burned brighter than all the others. Had his father been wrong, or had Theodore simply misunderstood what it truly meant to be a steward of history? Theodore felt a myriad of questions and contradictions overcoming his mind, but they led him to a new resolve. His father had taught him patience, discipline, and restraint. But history had spat them back in his face. He couldn't hope to break an oppressive system by playing by its own corrupt rules. If knowledge and subtlety were not enough to fracture the past, then it was time to take a different approach. What if history's flow was too rigid to prevent the loss of a life? Could it be more flexible if it meant ensuring a loss instead? The scent of gunpowder and old books transitioned to that of pretzels and beer before his vision had fully settled. Crimson banners draped across the city as the hum of fervent voices filled the air. This time he wasn't here to save someone. This time he was here to make sure they met an early fate. Munich, Germany, 1939. A Führer's narrow escape.
I did what I did out of necessity. If my act changes the course of history, then so be it. Georg Elser.
Theodore Langley emerged from the temporal vortex into the crisp air of München, Germany. Unlike his previous attempts in Sarajevo, Rome, and Dallas, he was no longer seeking to preserve a life, he was looking to end one. The city buzzed with fervent National Socialism, a brewing storm beneath the veneer of beer halls and patriotic songs. He adjusted his plain worker's uniform, blending into the restless crowd. The scent of pretzels and smoke drifted through the streets, but Theodore had little time to take in the details. He had long since abandoned the idea of changing his father's fate. The Great War had claimed him as it had so many others, and no amount of study had yielded a moment where history wavered, where time had left room for interference. It was a loss he had come to accept only reluctantly and bitterly. If he could not reclaim his father from history's grasp, he could still defy it. What had started as an effort to preserve life had twisted into something else entirely. History had rebuffed him at every turn, mocking his efforts with its stubborn inertia. Theodore realized he needed to be just as stubborn if he hoped to conquer history. He had failed in Sarajevo, Rome, and Dallas, each time trying to alter history through the preservation of life, only to watch it course forward undeterred. This time, if history refused to bend through means of reason and subtlety, perhaps it could be broken through force. He would not need to pull the trigger himself, only ensure that someone else did. Theodore had meticulously studied the events of this day, November 8, 1939. Adolf Hitler was scheduled to deliver a speech at the Bürgerbräu Keller, commemorating the anniversary of his failed 1923 coup. It was here that a German carpenter, Georg Elser, had planted a bomb, But history had conspired against him. Hitler's speech would end early, and the bomb would detonate too late. 13 minutes decided the fate of millions. Theodore's role was simple: keep Hitler in the hall long enough to force history's hand. As evening descended, he joined the sea of bodies surging into the Burgerbräu-Keller. The hall was a storm of red banners and black insignias, the air saturated with the stench of smoke and fervor. He edged toward the rear, watching as Elser made his final adjustments, his face unreadable. Theodore felt a strange pang of admiration. A man with no foreknowledge of the future, armed only with conviction, had come closer to altering history than Theodore ever had. As Theodore moved past Elser and moved into his position, a hand clamped around his wrist. "You don't belong here." Theodore froze. "You're not the first and you won't be the last." Then, just as suddenly, the grip released. Theodore spun, but the man was gone, swallowed by the crowd. A trickle of unease crawled up his spine, but he shoved it aside. He had no time to ponder. Back towards the wall, he turned towards the stage. Adolf Hitler arrived to thunderous applause, his presence electrifying the entire hall. He began his speech, the crowd swaying with his every word. Theodore positioned himself near the exit, watching intently as Hitler's voice rang through the hall, his Austrian accent sharp and commanding.
"Germany stands at a crossroads,"
Hitler declared, his voice a sharpened blade. The crowd roared in agreement, the floor vibrating under Theodore's feet.
"Our enemies fear us because they know what we are capable of,"
Hitler continued, his cadence accelerating. Theodore clenched his fists. The speech was moving too fast. He had studied hours of footage, learned Hitler's usual tempo, and planned for interruptions, but tonight, something was different. His pace was erratic and rushed, his words curt and piercing.
"We will not be silenced."
Hitler's voice rose to a fever pitch. Theodore's pulse quickened. He had planned to make every disruption as necessary, but Hitler was deviating from his usual rhythm, pushing forward with almost frantic urgency. If he finished too soon, Theodore's carefully laid plans would collapse before they even began. Desperate to stall for time, Theodore shoved a stack of beer mugs from a nearby table. The crash was deafening, glass shattering against the wooden floor, sending shards skidding across the hall. Gasps rippled through the crowd, heads turning toward the disturbance. Hitler faltered mid-sentence, his piercing eyes snapping toward the source of the noise. For a fleeting moment, Theodore met his gaze, a cold, assessing stare, sharp with irritation, but unreadable beyond that. The seconds stretched unbearably. Was there suspicion, recognition, or merely contempt for the fool who had disrupted his speech? The murmurs faded, and with an abrupt shake of his head, Hitler dismissed the distraction. His expression hardened once again, and he pressed on, voice rising with renewed urgency, but now he spoke even faster, as though the interruption had only spurred him to finish sooner. Theodore's heart pounded, his plan was slipping away. He scanned the room for more means of delay, but before he could act, Hitler reached his final words.
"Germany will not wait. We will not cower. The time for action is now."
With this final cry, Hitler thrust his right arm forward in a rigid salute, his expression fierce, almost feverish. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, their voices swelling into chants that echoed through the hall. Even as their fervor reached its peak, Hitler wasted no time. His salute barely held before he turned sharply, striding toward the exit with determined haste. His guards fell in step, forming a tight phalanx as they hurried him away, leaving Theodore standing in the dissipating roar of the crowd, his carefully laid plans unraveling before his eyes. Theodore's breath caught in his throat. He glanced at his timepiece. 9:18 p.m. He had failed again, despite his best efforts. He would surely be shot if he tried anything else here. He slipped away quickly, with no time to warn anyone, because at precisely 9:20 an explosion rocked the Burgerbräu-Keller, reducing it to rubble. 8 people perished and dozens were injured, but Hitler remained unscathed, untouched by history, unshaken by fate, and off to doom millions of innocent lives. History laughed in Theodore's face yet again. Theodore clenched his fists as he watched the dust of the building fly into the air, with the crowd panicked and the wail of sirens rising in the distance. Another failure, Another moment lost to the grip of history. He had abandoned preservation for destruction, only to find that history resisted him all the same. Sarajevo, Rome, Dallas, and now Munich. No matter his approach, history mocked his efforts, immutable, indifferent, untouched by his will. Theodore begrudgingly activated his timepiece, the warmth of steam desperate to calm his nerves of rage and mystification. The dark night of Munich dissolved into a swirl of heat and motion, but this time, something was different. A harrowing thought burned beneath the surface, cutting through the frustration like a blade through fog. Someone had known. Someone had seen him. Not just seen him, but understood. A stranger in the crowd had spoken with familiarity and certainty. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." They hadn't stopped him. They hadn't turned him in. They didn't shoot him. They had simply let him go. Why? If history was so unyielding, if all paths led to the same end, why had this figure not fought against him? Are there more out there? Theodore's thoughts tumbled as they landed in another time and place. His father's study, hazy and flickering in the recesses of his mind. He was a boy again, perched at the edge of his father's desk, watching as the old man turned the pages of a leather-bound manuscript. The parchment was filled with strange diagrams, twisting lines that wove together and diverged at impossible points. "This doesn't make sense," his father murmured with furrowed brows, tracing a finger over the ink. "None of these lines should cross, yet the end results remain the same." He paused, flipping to another page. History corrects itself, yet there are variations. An event can happen in many ways, but how? His father's brow furrowed, his restless gaze drifting before settling on Theodore. A slow smile crossed his face. "Perhaps you'll learn things I'll never know." The memory splintered, cracking apart as Theodore staggered back into the present. His timepiece sputtered weakly, steam hissing in uneven bursts. It was wearing down. He was wearing down. Every failed attempt gnawed at the edges of his mind, tearing at the very core of who he was and what his father's sacrifice had meant. "There are variations," his father's voice echoed in his ears, a weighty reminder of the burden Theodore carried. He had tried to navigate the twists, hoping for subtlety to guide him to the right moment, but subtlety never worked, only encouraging history to push him aside. What if understanding alone wasn't enough? What if history wasn't a river to be steered, but a dam to be shattered? The calculating and measured Theodore Langley he had once been was now slipping through his fingers, eroded by the failures and near misses. Theodore pondered his new plan as his senses filled with the scents of sugarcane and cigar smoke and the sounds of heavy footsteps and hushed voices. This time there would be no room for mistakes. No more trusting fate, no more reliance on the hope that others would act as they should. History would bend to his will, not the other way around. He would make the world crack under the weight of his resolve. The careful plans had led him nowhere. This time he would force the change. His father's lessons had led him here, but his path forward would be different. Brute force, not reason, would surely break history's flow. Cuba, 1961, in the shadow of the Bay of Pigs.
A man who has the courage to fight for his ideals is a man who makes history. Fidel Castro.
Theodore Langley emerged from the swirling vortex, greeted by the humid air, thick with salt and sweat. He crouched low in the dense Cuban jungle, his borrowed fatigues damp against his skin, M14 rifle close to his side. The sounds of distant gunfire crackled through the overcast day. The Bay of Pigs invasion was already beginning. Another war, another moment history demanded to remain unchanged. But Theodore refused to comply. His father had died in a war he couldn't stop. This time he would make it mean something by forcing history's hand. Like in Dallas 2 years later, he fought to prevent wars bigger than his father could have possibly imagined. And like in Munich 22 years ago, he wasn't preventing an assassination. Now he's prepared to commit one himself. His target, Fidel Castro. The CIA had tried and failed countless times to erase the dictator's existence through exploding cigars, dive suits lined with tuberculosis, and even absurd psychological ploys. Theodore, however, had something they didn't: certainty. He knew exactly where Castro would be, how the battle would unfold, and most importantly, where to strike. This wasn't some idealistic experiment anymore. If history was capable of changing at all, he would be the one to force it. Moving stealthily through the undergrowth, Theodore reached a ridge overlooking the Playa Girón. Below, CIA Cuban exiles waded through the surf and met relentless fire from Castro's forces. The invasion was gruesomely unraveling just as history dictated. Theodore wasn't here to fix the invasion. He knew that was doomed. His only goal was to eliminate Castro, to change the trajectory of the Cold War for the better, preventing further bloody tension between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Through the trees he spotted movement, a convoy of Cuban troops making their way toward the beach. At the center of the column, clad in his signature brown fatigues and cap, was Fidel Castro himself, standing in the open bed of a jeep, cigar lit in hand. Lying prone in the grass, Theodore raised his rifle, steadying his aim with the bipod. One shot was all it took. One pull of the trigger, and he could alter history. No Cuban Missile Crisis, no paranoid proxy wars, no decades-long communist stronghold in the Western Hemisphere. Theodore held his breath as he peered through the scope, its reticle centered on Castro's chest. Timing his shot between heartbeats, he nearly pulled the trigger when he heard a rustling behind him. Before he could react to the sound, a soldier flipped him around, landing punches on his face. Hands grasped at Theodore's arms, the soldier pulled him on his feet. Theodore thrashed, but more soldiers restrained him. Voices shouted over one another in urgent, clipped Spanish.
Tranquilo, no se mueva.
Above the chaos, the distant rumble of Castro's jeep faded into the night as the soldiers dragged Theodore away. Failure gripped him once again. Sometime afterwards, Theodore found himself bound to a chair in a dimly lit interrogation room, the thick scent of tobacco and sweat clinging to the stale air. A Cuban officer loomed over him, sifting through the contents of Theodore's backpack. An outdated map, American dollars, and, most dangerously, his brass timepiece.
You're not one of the invaders. Who are you?
Theodore kept his gaze low, his silence calculated. It didn't matter. He failed again. And now he was about to rot in a Cuban prison if they didn't kill him first.
Silencio?
The officer chuckled, the sound devoid of humor.
That's not going to work, friend.
Theodore didn't flinch, his expression stone cold. The officer's questions grew more insistent, but Theodore remained mute. The officer leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as he inspected Theodore.
What are you doing here?
Theodore gave no response.
You think silence will save you?
With a furrowed brow, the officer picked up the timepiece, freely passing it between his hands as he paced back and forth.
This isn't a normal watch. What is it?
Theodore's jaw tightened, avoiding eye contact and replying through his teeth. A keepsake.
A keepsake that ticks but has no hands.
The officer studied the delicate timepiece, looking back at Theodore with growing suspicion.
A keepsake that sounds like a machine.
Theodore refused to meet his gaze, but the officer seemed to understand. His suspicion deepened as if he could read between the lines of Theodore's silence.
You carry an old map, but your clothes don't match. They're neither American nor Soviet, just like your accent.
The officer stepped even closer, his dark eyes locking onto Theodore's with an almost knowing glint.
You're out of place, Mr. Langley.
Theodore's heart skipped. His name, how did he know? His mind raced, thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. No one should know him here. No one in history should know him. The officer's lips curled into a slight knowing smile as he spoke again, shifting seamlessly from Spanish to accented English.
Yes, we know many things, Mr. Langley.
He set the dirt-stained timepiece on the table between them, oddly with care.
But you are a mystery.
The officer leaned back, fingers steepled, watching Theodore as if he were waiting for something. Some flicker of recognition, some shared secret that Theodore wasn't yet privy to.
Tell me, Mr. Langley, what time are you really from?
A chill ran through Theodore's spine. He kept his face impassive, but inside, his thoughts raced. How? How could this man possibly know who Theodore is? Did he know where Theodore was when he first arrived? No one in history should have recognized him, and yet the officer spoke with a familiarity that made Theodore's skin crawl. The officer paused for a long moment before exhaling, shaking his head.
You don't have to answer. I already know more than you think.
He stood and walked around the table, his footsteps slow and deliberate.
I've seen men like you before. Ones who don't belong. You think you're above us, don't you? Above time itself?
Theodore kept his gaze steady, unwilling to show weakness. But the officer's words struck too close to something deep within him. The belief that he could change history, that he could bend time to his will, had defined his mission. Yet here was this officer with a seemingly unsettling understanding of his purpose. The officer's words brought back an old memory. His father's voice. Steady and patient as they sat together at his workbench. They were cleaning the timepiece, methodically disassembling each impossibly small part when his father spoke. Some people think they stand outside history. He held up the delicate gears between his fingers, the brass catching the dim light. They're wrong. No matter how much you twist and wind the clock, it still keeps ticking, and so does history. Theodore had been too young to fully understand then. But now, staring into the eyes of a man who seemed to have lived this truth before, he felt something shift. The officer paused by the door, glancing back at Theodore one last time.
Maybe after a while alone, in your cell, you'll decide to answer my questions. Until then, enjoy the silence.
The door slammed shut. Moments later, rough hands lifted Theodore out of the chair and dragged him down the dim corridor, his mind reeling. Several hours later, Theodore woke to the sound of shackling iron bars. His bruised face throbbed as he saw the door slightly ajar and his bag hanging by the strap, beckoning for his retrieval. Theodore had no time to wonder how this could have happened. He quickly searched his bag, found his timepiece, and turned the gears, steam sputtering through the tubes. As he escaped, a sickening realization settled in Theodore's gut. Chance, an ever-present element. Every attempt, no matter how carefully crafted, had been undone by chance. A stray interruption, a minor delay, a last-minute change of plans. History was not written solely by grand events, but also by the forgotten, trivial details no one recorded. The missing thoughts and actions of people never documented. The unseen currents beneath every person's decision. Theodore's pulse quickened with an unsettling thought. Was history really as mutable as he had believed? Or did it have its own momentum, an invisible hand steering its course, regardless of his presence? Worse yet, someone had recognized him, again. The officer knew him, knew his name, even though they should have been strangers. This wasn't the first time. A voice in Munich had stopped him, spoken to him with an eerie familiarity. Who were these people? What were they? Too many questions, too many unknowns, too many failures. For the first time since he had begun this mission, Theodore let himself feel the full weight of what he had feared. Doubt. He had always believed his gift came with a moral responsibility, a duty to change the course of history. What else was he supposed to do but use it for good? What could be more righteous than preventing the tragedies that had taken his father away? Yet now, in the quiet of his failure, the very purpose that had driven him seemed more like an illusion. What if history refused to be rewritten? What if the past was as immovable as it seemed? And if that was the case, what was left? Hide, abandon the mission, destroy the timepiece? This thought stirred something deeper. A memory. He was a boy again, sitting cross-legged on the floor of his father's study, watching intently as his father traced his fingers over the worn pages of an old manuscript. Theodore had asked why some of the pages were marked with careful annotations, while others remained untouched. Because some things must be observed before they can be changed. He pointed to a passage, a historical account of a war long since past. Understanding isn't about deciding what should have happened, it's about seeing why it did. The young Theodore frowned, not yet able to grasp the full weight of his father's words. His father smiled patiently, setting the book aside and picking up the timepiece, With practiced ease, he wound it between his fingers. A clock doesn't force time forward, Theo. It only helps you read it. The memory hit Theodore with startling clarity now. His hands tightened around the timepiece, the cool metal grounding him as he absorbed the lesson again. Understanding. Not forcing history, but studying it. Learning its rhythm, not battling it. That was what he had been missing. Forcing his will on history had been an illusion, one that had slipped through his fingers like sand. Perhaps his father had been right all along. Maybe it wasn't about rewriting the past. Maybe it was about learning from it, understanding its flow. In that understanding, there might be a way to honor his father's sacrifice without the need to fight against time. He needed to understand. He needed to learn from the past, instead of trying to fight it. Theodore realized something he hadn't previously. It wasn't about bending history to his will. It was about seeing where it had been so that he might find the right way forward. Perhaps there was still a way for him to change history's course, but Theodore was not going to get anywhere without learning its ways. With that understanding, the weight of doubt began to lift, replaced by something else. A quiet sense of direction. Maybe, just maybe, in understanding the past, he could unlock the key to controlling its flow. Then he would know where history's secrets truly lay, and how to honor his father's legacy in a way that no one, not even time, could erase. 2. A Steward's Enlightenment. Part 1. Seeking Solace. Theodore Langley had waged war against history and lost. Sarajevo, Rome, Dallas, Munich, Cuba. Each attempt more precise, each intervention more desperate, yet they had only proven what his father had once murmured between lessons. History did not yield. It did not bend to mercy or force, nor did it break under the weight of his will. It remained indifferent, unshaken. Why? His father had always insisted that understanding must precede action, that history was not an enemy to be conquered, but a pattern to be studied. Yet Theodore had spent years imposing his will upon the past, convinced that fate could be rewritten if he only struck the right chord. If force could not shape history, then perhaps knowledge could unlock its secrets. Perhaps history was not a battlefield, but a code, one that, if deciphered, might reveal how to ease human suffering and honor the man who had died, believing in something greater than himself. For once, Theodore did not set his timepiece for the moments where history teetered on the edge of decisive change. Instead, he turned the gears toward those who had sought to understand it. If history resisted him, then he would learn why, from the very minds that had spent their lives unraveling its mysteries. Theodore had exhausted himself, risking everything in each doomed attempt. Perhaps, at last, he would find the peace and rest he had spent a lifetime chasing. Halicarnassus, Anatolia, 425 BCE, the father of history.
The most important thing in life is to learn what you can and to be wise enough to understand what is right. Herodotus.
The salty breeze of the Aegean carried the scent of fish and parchment as Theodore Langley strode through the bustling streets of Halicarnassus. Sunlight gleamed off whitewashed stone, and the voices of merchants haggling over goods wove into the distant crash of waves. He had spent so long trying to bend history to his will. Perhaps the original historian could teach him what he had failed to grasp. The modest home near the marketplace was unremarkable, but inside, it felt like the beating heart of history itself. Scrolls lined the walls, ink-stained tablets lay stacked in precarious towers, and maps of the known world curled at the edges from repeated study. At the center of it all sat a man draped in a simple tunic, his beard streaked white with wisdom, his eyes sharp with curiosity.
"You are not from here,"
Herodotus said, barely glancing up from his work. It wasn't a question. Theodore hesitated. He had hidden himself in every era, yet time itself seemed to leave a mark on him, rendering himself transparent. He swallowed and stepped forward. If a man knew the course of history and sought to change it, why would he fail? Herodotus set aside his quill and leaned back, stroking his beard.
Because history is not a single road, but many intertwining paths. Some are well-trodden, others hidden away. You may try to alter one, but the others continue forward, weaving together again.
But what if a man could see where they lead? Should he not act to prevent suffering? The historian chuckled, his eyes alight with something that unsettled Theodore. Not dismissal, but understanding.
But who decides which path is right? Who is worthy to judge whose suffering is necessary and whose is unjust? If a man diverts a river to save one village, does he not starve another downstream?
Theodore's breath caught. He had stood at the fulcrum of history, choosing whom to save, whom to condemn, all under the belief that he alone had the clarity to make that choice. What if he had never possessed such clarity at all? Did he mistake his sense of conviction for certainty? His agency for inevitability? Herodotus had once warned in his work that nations rose and fell in cycles, that fate and fortune turned as inexorably as the tides. What if in trying to impose his will upon history he had become just another force in the current, no different from the forces and people that lived in their time around him? Herodotus continued, his voice steady and deliberate.
History is not a beast to be tamed, nor a battle to be won. It is a great river flowing ever onward. Some throw stones to change its course. Others build dams, but always, always, the water finds its way.
A chill ran through Theodore's spine. He had spent years fighting against the current only to be swept away time and time again. He had believed his failures were his own, that if he could only plan better, act faster, strike at the right moment, he could reshape the world as he saw fit. What if his failures were all inevitable, not because of his own limitations, but because of the very nature of history itself?
You have much to learn,
Herodotus said, rolling up a scroll.
Perhaps your place is not to change history, but to understand it, as is the duty of all historians.
Theodore clenched his jaw. His father had taught him to exercise his agency, to challenge assumptions, to act when others hesitated. Had he been so fixated on action that he had forgotten to truly see? Herodotus did not shape the world, yet his words outlived the men who ruled it. His histories had inspired Thucydides, Polybius, and countless others. Historians who sought truth not in conquest, but in understanding. Theodore had spent so much of his time trying to force history's hand, to mold it into something it refused to become. From Sarajevo to Cuba, all of his strategies failed to save his father. What if instead he sought to comprehend history's design, just as he had once understood the inner workings of his timepiece, not by forcing it to move, but by studying how it functioned? As Herodotus dipped his quill into ink, Theodore activated his aging timepiece. If history would not yield to force, then perhaps wisdom would reveal the threads that bound it. Perhaps understanding, not intervention, was the key. And who better to seek out than the man who had unraveled history with questions? Athens, Greece, 399 BCE, the death of Socrates.
The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates.
The air was thick with dust and incense as Theodore stood before the Athenian court, blending into the crowd. At its center stood Socrates, unshaken as usual, as his trial reached its climax. He stood accused and convicted of corrupting the youth of Athens with his obsessive, questioning nature. A veteran of the Peloponnesian War, Socrates witnessed the fall of Greek tyranny to be replaced by Greek democracy. But whispers of revolution still roamed the Athenian zeitgeist. They found in Socrates an easy scapegoat, for his real crime was exposing the true uncertainty that Athens' leaders hid inside. Once they determined how dangerous his questioning method had become, his fate was sealed. And as far as Socrates was concerned, he had done his duty. Theodore knew he had mere moments before the sentence was delivered. Pushing forward, he caught Socrates' gaze. Socrates' gaze lingered on him. Not with suspicion nor with curiosity, but with something unsettlingly close to familiarity, as if he had seen him before. "Teacher Socrates," Theodore called. If a man had the power to change the course of history, why would he fail? The court hushed as the philosopher tilted his head, amused.
Do I look like a man who concerns himself with changing history?
Murmurs rippled through the court. The judge scowled. Theodore pressed on. But if one knew what was to come, wars, suffering, injustice, should he not act to prevent it? Socrates smiled.
Tell me, my friend, if a man knew his fate and sought to change it, is he not already following the path fate laid for him?
Theodore faltered.
History is not a beast to be tamed. It is a mirror, reflecting the nature of men. Change men, and history will follow. Attempting to change history alone?
He shook his head.
You have surely learned the answer yourself.
A cup of hemlock was placed before the philosopher. Theodore stood paralyzed as Socrates lifted it with steady hands. In that moment, something else cut through his thoughts. A lingering gaze, an almost imperceptible knowing. Had Socrates expected him? As the philosopher drank his death, Theodore activated his timepiece. Herodotus saw history as a force too vast to be tamed. Socrates believed history was merely a reflection of people shaped by their choices rather than an independent entity to be manipulated. Socrates' words settled into him like an echo. Hadn't his father said something similar once? His father, perched at the kitchen table, taught him the art of thinking critically. The cluttered table was always scattered with books, and a worn map of the world hung on the wall with lines marking routes his father had traced in his younger years. Theodore, younger then, had often asked, why do we have to think through everything? Why not just go with what's obvious? His father, looking up from his papers with a half smile, had replied, the obvious is only obvious until you look closer. People see things one way and then they stop looking. You must keep questioning even when you're sure you found the answer. That's when the truth starts to show itself if you are honestly searching for it. At the time, Theodore had found his father's words frustrating, but now, as Socrates' words mirrored his father's lessons, the meaning settled into him. The obvious answer, change history by force, wasn't the right one. Maybe it never was. Reasonable insights, Theodore thought, but they raised more questions than answers. If history could not be rewritten, why was he able to move through it? Why did everyone seem to recognize him, as if he were not the first to challenge time's dominion? If altering events was impossible, was there at least a way to understand what controls their course? Theodore needed broader perspectives, minds that had wrestled with fate, causality, and the tides of human action. Some had argued that history was shaped not by passive forces, but by those bold enough to impose their will upon it. If that were true, then perhaps they would recognize the flaw in Theodore's approach. If history was indeed shaped by those bold enough to impose their will upon it, then perhaps the next mind he sought would teach him how. With a steadying breath, Theodore reached for his timepiece. The familiar pull of the vortex seized him, and when the world reassembled, the scent of ink and burning incense filled his lungs. The stuttering hiss of his timepiece drifted through a sunlit courtyard. Lu, China, 500 BCE, Confucius and History's Calling.
Real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. Confucius.
Theodore Langley had sought answers from Herodotus, who chronicled history's course, and from Socrates, who questioned its nature. Yet something was still missing. If history reflected human nature, as Socrates suggested, then understanding humanity itself was the key. But could history truly be changed by guiding people rather than by rewriting events? If so, what right did he have to intervene at all? Confucius sat beneath the sprawling branches of a gnarled cypress tree, a group of attentive students surrounding him. Theodore approached, wearied by his search, the weight of his failures pressing heavier with each step. Confucius caught sight of him, offering a gesture to sit.
You are troubled,
the sage observed with his calm, penetrating gaze. I've tried to change history, Theodore confessed, his voice tinged with frustration. But every time my actions seemed to merely reaffirm its course. Confucius nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful.
A ruler who forces his will upon his people without understanding them does not guide, merely pushes.
And what happens when people are pushed against their will?
They resist, Theodore murmured, or they undo what I've done. His thoughts flashed to the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. He had intercepted the assassin's path, only for another to take his place. He had stalled Caesar's murder by mere moments before the daggers found their mark anyway. Every dam he built had burst. The sage's eyes sharpened, his voice unwavering.
A great flood will carve its path, no matter how many dams you build. A wise man does not fight the river. He teaches the people to prepare, to endure, to shape their lives around its flow. Thus they do not suffer the flood, they master it.
Theodore's pulse quickened. If history could not be changed through force, then what of those who had shaped it? Were they merely swept along by history's currents beyond their control? Or had they in some way mastered history's flow? But if suffering lies ahead, should I not try to prevent it? Confucius's gaze remained gentle, yet firm, his words deliberate.
Any fool can see a storm and shout at the heavens. A wise man seeks shelter and teaches others to build strong roofs. What good is fighting fate when you could teach men how to live despite it?
Theodore clenched his fists. He had thought himself the architect of history, but at every turn his influence had been undone. Was he just another fool shouting at the heavens? Confucius smiled knowingly, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly.
To change history, time traveler, do not strike at the events themselves. Shape the hearts of its people. History is not written by moments. It is written by men.
Theodore's breath caught. Confucius's words struck at the heart of his doubts. Was history truly shaped by the hands of active participants, or was he deceiving himself in thinking he could direct its course? Could history only be altered if he imposed his will upon people, nudging them toward a certain path? Was that the true nature of his role? Do men really need to be guided to change history's course? Could they not just be nudged in the right direction? Confucius's brow furrowed ever so slightly, pondering.
You cannot prevent the flood of suffering itself, but you can guide the people to deal with it. Some will resist, but should the leader then abandon them? Should resistance deter the teacher from his duty?
Theodore stood silent, his thoughts churning. Had he been going about this the wrong way all along? If he had no power to alter history's great events, perhaps he had the power to shape those who lived through them. Was that any different from manipulation? Theodore paused before getting at the heart of his doubts. But what is knowledge if not the means to shape history? If I preserve it without action, without purpose, is it anything more than words locked away in stone? Confucius studied him for a long moment.
Knowledge is not merely what is written or remembered. It is what is lived. It is wisdom passed from teacher to student, from parent to child. It is not an artifact to be hoarded. It is a torch that must be carried.
Theodore frowned. Then does it matter who carries it? Who decides which knowledge survives? Confucius nodded approvingly at the question.
It matters greatly. Knowledge in the wrong hands can be as dangerous as ignorance. But does that mean we do not teach? That we do not share? A man does not hoard fire for fear of it burning his house. He learns to wield it.
Theodore exhaled slowly. If knowledge had power, then perhaps his role was not to change events outright, but to shape how knowledge passed through time. To teach, prepare, and ensure that the right minds understood the lessons of history. Was that enough? Could it truly change anything? Theodore bowed, but unease remained. He had learned from Herodotus that history was a force too vast to be tamed. Socrates had suggested that history was a reflection of men, not an independent entity. Confucius believed that men could be guided, that knowledge could shape the course of events, but was he the right one to guide them? Every attempt he had made to alter history had all ended in abject failure. His intervention swept away like sand before the tide. What if his efforts to shape men's hearts ended the same way? Could he trust himself to lead others when he had been so blind before? A quiet dread settled over him. If history resisted force and if even knowledge could be misused, was there another way? Was it possible to surrender to time's flow without losing the ability to act? Was there any wisdom in letting go? Theodore exhaled, slow and uncertain. If knowledge was a torch, then perhaps he needed to understand how to carry it, or even whether he should carry it at all. With that thought, he reached for his timepiece, steam hissing as the cypress tree dissolved into a secluded river valley.
The end. We hope you've enjoyed this production of
Theodore Langley, Gears of Thought and Steam, made with spoken. Preface. This work is the culmination of an idea I first conceived around my 30th birthday. By that time, I had rediscovered my passion for books and storytelling, and I found myself drawn to stories rooted in fact, those intertwined with history, science, and the pursuit of knowledge. Reality, as I came to appreciate it, is beautiful in its ever-evolving complexity. Since our understanding of the world is constantly shifting, there are infinite ways to tell stories, even if they are not wholly original. The stories in this collection began as a thought experiment. If one could go back in history, would anything actually change, and what trends would one see? What seemed like a simple premise unraveled into a much deeper exploration, one that touched on the nature of time travel, the persistence of human nature, and the ways in which knowledge endures. I became fascinated by the idea that the voices of the past could breathe again, allowing their insights and struggles to be experienced anew for us to learn from. I feel fortunate to live in an era where knowledge of the entire world is available at our fingertips, and the careful use of technology, including AI, allows us to reconstruct and reimagine historical figures and moments, bringing them to life once more through words on the page. When considering the form and structure of this work, I was drawn to the purity of short stories, with their ability to distill a handful of ideas without getting lost in the minutiae of world-building or a prolonged arc. Initially, I envisioned this as an anthology of loosely connected narratives, but as I wrote, a natural progression of ideas emerged. The stories evolved into a larger journey, one that follows a single character through encounters that each stand alone, yet collectively build upon one another, mirroring the unfolding of history itself. Beyond storytelling of both prose and education, my hope for this work is to offer an intellectual challenge, to use creative expression to pose questions that invite reflection on what gives meaning to our lives. What do we value? What will we leave behind? History is more than just a record of the past. It is a guide to shaping the future. By understanding those who came before us, we can better navigate the present and make choices that will resonate long beyond our own time.
Professional audiobooks in a click. Spoken.